The greatest threat to a civilization is never the barbarian at the gate. It is the accountant in the tower. Here lies the ultimate contradiction of history. The more powerful an empire becomes, the more dangerous it becomes to its own people. We are told the state exists to protect private property, yet the historical record reveals a terrifying paradox. Every dying empire attempts to save itself by looting the very citizens it swore to defend. The shield eventually becomes the sword. The protector becomes the predator. This is the empire tax pattern. To truly understand this inevitable cycle of destruction, we must first analyze the cold mechanics of imperial decline. An empire is, structurally speaking, a growth machine designed to consume. It survives and thrives by extracting new resources, arable land, slave labor, precious metals, from its periphery and funneling them to the center. But the physical world is finite. Eventually, the borders reach their natural geographic or military limit. The Roman legions halted at the Rhine. The British Navy reached the ends of the map. When the external inflow of easy wealth stops, the internal expenses do not pause. The bloated bureaucracy, the standing army, and the expensive entitlement programs remain hungry for funding. The state faces a binary choice: reduce its size to match reality, or find a new source of revenue. History shows they almost never choose to shrink. This financial pressure creates a distinct and dangerous psychological shift within the ruling class. The citizen is no longer viewed as a source of national strength or a partner in civilization, but merely as a resource to be mined, similar to a vein of silver or a forest of timber. This is the cannibalization phase. In the late Roman Empire, particularly under the reign of Diocletian, the tax collectors became more feared by the rural population than the invading barbarians. The state implemented a rigorous census, not to better understand its people, but to catalog every single taxable asset that could be seized. They counted every fruit tree, every vine, and every head of cattle. The relationship between the state and the individual was fundamentally rewritten from one of protection to one of systematic extraction. The true tragedy of this phase is that this predation is often sold to the public as patriotism. The state claims the new levies are temporary measures, necessary for the public good or national defense against vague threats. In pre-revolutionary France, the crown squeezed the peasantry until they had absolutely nothing left to give, all while exempting the aristocracy and clergy from the burden. The wealth pump always flows upward. The productive class, the merchants, the farmers, the artisans, are squeezed the hardest because they are the easiest targets. They are visible, immobile, and possess physical assets that cannot simply be hidden or moved offshore. The very people who built the economic foundation of the empire are the first to be consumed by its insatiable appetite. As the taxes rise to confiscatory levels, productivity inevitably plummets. Why work harder when the additional fruit of your labor is seized by the collector? This leads to the most dangerous symptom of all: capital flight. In the later stages of the Spanish Empire, silver from the Americas flowed straight through Spain and into the banks of Genoa and Amsterdam to pay debts. The wealthy found ways to hide their assets or leave the country entirely, leaving the middle class to bear the entire crushing burden alone. The economy begins to hollow out from the inside. The state, panic-stricken by the sudden drop in revenue, does not lower taxes to stimulate growth. Instead, it raises them further, accelerating the death spiral toward total collapse. When taxation finally reaches its physical and mathematical limit, when the state can no longer squeeze blood from a stone, the government turns to a more insidious, invisible tool. It is a silent tax that requires no armed collectors, no door-to-door audits, and no legislative approval. It is the theft of value itself from within the currency. They begin to dilute the money supply, a betrayal that rots the economy from the molecular level upward. Monetary debasement is the oldest and most destructive trick in the bureaucratic playbook. Nero was the first Roman emperor to do it systematically, secretly reducing the silver content of the denarius to pay his bills. At first, it seemed like pure magic. The state could suddenly pay its debts and its soldiers with money created out of thin air. But this is not wealth creation. It is a fraudulent wealth transfer. By increasing the supply of money without increasing the supply of goods and services, the state steals purchasing power from every saver, pensioner, and wage earner. It is a retroactive tax on history, stealing the value of work that was already done, taxed, and saved by the citizenry. The effects of this inflation tax are devastating precisely because they are unevenly distributed. The new money does not enter the economy all at once. It enters through specific channels. The state and those closest to the money printer, the military contractors, the political favorites, and the banks, get to spend the new money first while prices are still low. This phenomenon is known as the Cantillon effect. By the time the new money ripples out to reach the peasant or the shopkeeper, prices for bread and fuel have already adjusted upward. The elite essentially shop at yesterday's prices with today's printed money, while the poor are forced to pay tomorrow's prices with yesterday's stagnant wages. History is littered with the corpses of currencies murdered by their own governments. The Weimar Republic, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. These are not modern anomalies. They are the terminal stage of the ancient pattern. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian attempted to fix the massive inflation he caused by issuing the edict on maximum prices, threatening the death penalty to anyone who sold goods above a fixed state price. The result was immediate catastrophe. Goods simply disappeared from the shelves. The economy collapsed into a primitive barter system. The complex trade networks of the empire disintegrated because the price signal, the nervous system of the economy, had been severed by government decree. This chaotic stage marks the end of economic freedom and the beginning of totalitarianism. To enforce the use of their failing, worthless currency, the state must increase surveillance and control to draconian levels. They ban the private ownership of gold. They restrict travel. They implement strict capital controls to trap wealth inside the borders. The free market becomes a black market. The citizen who tries to protect their family's wealth is branded a criminal, a traitor, or a hoarder. The state, having failed in its primary duty to protect property, now exists solely to confiscate it. The social contract is irrevocably broken, and the empire enters its final twilight. As the economy stagnates and the currency rots, a new phenomenon emerges within the capital. It is the explosion of the administrative state. In a healthy society, the government exists to support the productive population. But in a dying empire, this relationship inverts. The bureaucracy begins to grow like a cancer, replicating itself not to solve problems, but to justify its own existence. The number of laws, regulations, and officials skyrockets precisely when the civilization is becoming less complex and less wealthy. It is the rise of the parasite class. This expansion of bureaucracy serves a very specific political purpose. As the private sector collapses under the weight of taxation and inflation, the state becomes the only viable employer. To prevent unemployment riots, the government creates useless administrative jobs. In 17th century Spain, as the productive economy withered, the number of nobles, lawyers, and government officials exploded. Being close to the tax stream became the only way to survive. The best minds of the generation, the would-be inventors, explorers, and merchants, are sucked into the vacuum of state service, dedicating their lives to paperwork rather than progress. This new class of administrators needs something to do. Since they produce nothing, they must regulate those who do. They invent new licenses, permits, and restrictions. In the late Byzantine Empire, trade was strangled by a web of regulations so complex that only the politically connected could navigate them. This is the death of the small business owner. The cobbler, the baker, and the blacksmith cannot afford the army of scribes needed to comply with the new laws. They are forced out of business or into the black market, leaving the economy dominated by state-backed monopolies that have the resources to bribe the regulators. The tragedy is that the parasite class is self-perpetuating. Once a department is created to manage a crisis, it has a vested interest in that crisis never being solved. If the problem goes away, so does their funding. During the fall of Rome, the number of tax collectors eventually exceeded the number of taxpayers in some provinces. The overhead cost of civilization became heavier than the civilization itself could bear. The state becomes a heavy, golden sarcophagus, suffocating the society it was meant to protect. Ultimately, this leads to a complete paralysis of decision-making. With so many layers of bureaucracy, no one is responsible for anything. Vital repairs to infrastructure are delayed by committees. Urgent military orders are lost in triplicate forms. The empire becomes a giant, blind beast, flailing in the dark. It creates the illusion of activity, meetings, decrees, edicts, while the actual foundations of the state crumble into dust. The citizens stop looking to the state for solutions and start looking at it as the primary obstacle to their survival. As the internal economy rots and the people grow restless, the empire faces a crisis of legitimacy. To maintain control and project an illusion of strength, the state pivots to the one thing it can still manufacture: war. The military, once the servant of the empire, begins to consume it. The legions are no longer fighting for defense or profitable conquest. They are fighting to justify their own budget. This is the Praetorian Trap, when the cost of the military machine outweighs the value of what it protects. In the late stages of empire, the military becomes a mercenary force. The citizen soldier, fighting for his home and family, is replaced by the paid professional fighting for a paycheck. When the debased currency inevitably loses value, these soldiers demand more. If the state cannot pay, the legions revolt. In the 3rd century crisis of Rome, emperors were assassinated and replaced at the whim of the Praetorian Guard. The army ceased to be a tool of the state and became a ransom demand held against the emperor's head. The defense budget becomes a black hole that no tax revenue can ever fill. To justify this expense, the state must manufacture constant conflict. Forever wars are not a modern invention. They are a historical necessity for failing empires. They serve as a distraction from domestic misery. If the people are hungry, give them an enemy to hate. The state exaggerates threats, turning minor border skirmishes into existential crises. This allows the government to label domestic critics as traitors and sympathizers, further tightening their grip on power. The war economy becomes the only economy left, sucking resources away from agriculture and trade. However, this military expansion is an illusion. The actual fighting capability of the empire is degrading. Because the economy has been hollowed out, the supply lines are brittle. The ships are built with inferior wood. The armor is made of cheaper metal. We saw this with the Ottoman Empire in its sick man of Europe phase. They had a massive army on paper, but they could not equip or feed it. They were a paper tiger, terrifying from a distance but fragile to the touch. The empire projects strength to the world while rotting from the inside. The final stage of the Praetorian Trap is when the empire turns its military inward. When the external enemies are either defeated or paid off, the army is used to collect taxes and suppress riots. The police state is born. The weapons designed for foreign conquest are turned against the citizens. This is the moment the psychological break is complete. The people realize that the army is not there to protect them from the barbarians. The army is the barbarian. The protector has become the occupier. With the middle class destroyed, the currency debased, and the military turning inward, the state faces a massive population of destitute, angry citizens. How do you prevent a revolution when you have stolen the people's future? You buy their silence. This is the pacification protocol. In Rome, it was known as bread and circuses. It is the transition of the citizen from a self-reliant contributor to a state-dependent ward. It is the final bribe paid by the dying empire to its own people. The welfare state of a dying empire is not an act of charity. It is an act of security. In Rome, over 200,000 citizens received free grain daily. This created a permanent underclass that was dependent on the state for their very survival. If they rebelled, they starved. This dependency weaponizes hunger. It ensures that the population will always vote for or support the politician who promises the most free resources. The political debate shifts from how do we create wealth to how do we divide the shrinking pile of loot. The mob becomes the most powerful political force, and the demagogue becomes their king. But bread is not enough. The people must also be distracted from their misery. The state sponsors increasingly elaborate and violent entertainment. In Constantinople, the population was obsessed with the chariot races at the Hippodrome. The blues and the greens were not just sports teams, they were political gangs. The state encouraged this tribalism because if the people were fighting each other over chariot races, they weren't fighting the emperor over taxes. The spectacle becomes a narcotic, numbing the population to the reality of their collapsing world. This creates a cultural rot. The values of hard work, thrift, and independence are mocked. Why work in the fields when the state gives you grain? Why save money when the currency is worthless? The hero of the society is no longer the builder or the soldier, but the celebrity and the gladiator. The moral fiber of the civilization disintegrates. In 18th century France, while the peasantry starved, the court at Versailles engaged in endless, frivolous parties and fashion obsessions. The elite disconnect from reality, retreating into a bubble of pleasure while the storm clouds gather. The pacification protocol is expensive. It accelerates the very economic collapse it is trying to hide. The state must print more money and raise more taxes to pay for the bread and the games. It is a feedback loop of doom. Eventually, the money runs out. The grain shipments stop. The games are canceled. And when the pacification protocol fails, the illusion shatters. The mob, realize they have been sold into slavery for a few crumbs, finally turns its rage upward. This is usually the moment the guillotine is wheeled out. As the empire enters its twilight, a paradox emerges. The weaker the state becomes, the more it tries to control. It is the panic of a drowning man grabbing at water. The government, terrified of the chaos it has created, attempts to freeze the economy in place. They pass laws forbidding people from changing professions, forbidding farmers from leaving their land, and forbidding merchants from setting their own prices. This is the regulatory stranglehold. It is the attempt to outlaw reality. The most destructive form of this control is the ossification of labor. In the late Roman Empire, Emperor Diocletian made professions hereditary. If your father was a baker, you had to be a baker. If your father was a soldier, you had to be a soldier. This destroyed social mobility. The dream of rising above your station was illegal. This caste system was designed to ensure that the state always had enough workers in critical industries, but it had the opposite effect. It killed motivation. Innovation died because no one was free to pursue new ideas. The economy became a prison. Simultaneously, the state attacks the mechanisms of trade. Protectionism becomes the law of the land. In a desperate attempt to keep wealth inside the borders, the empire erects massive tariffs and trade barriers. They ban imports and subsidize failing domestic industries. This is the autarky trap. They believe they can be self-sufficient, but they only succeed in cutting themselves off from the world's innovation and resources. The Great Depression was exacerbated by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which strangled global trade. When goods stop crossing borders, armies usually do. To enforce these unnatural laws, the legal system is weaponized. Justice is no longer blind. It is a tool of revenue collection. In the dying days of the Soviet Union, economic crimes, like speculation or hoarding, were punished more severely than murder. The entrepreneur is criminalized. The man who tries to fix a shortage by bringing in goods is thrown in prison. The state creates a society where the only way to succeed is to break the law. This creates a culture of corruption where bribery is the only way to get anything done. The ultimate result of the regulatory stranglehold is the gray economy. When the legal economy becomes impossible, the real economy goes underground. In modern Venezuela or ancient Rome, the actual business of survival happens in back alleys and secret meetings. The state technically controls everything, but in reality, it controls nothing. It issues decrees that are openly ignored. The government becomes a phantom, shouting orders that vanish into the wind. The society has already moved on. The state is just the last one to know it is dead. When the regulatory stranglehold fails to stop the bleeding, and the printing press can no longer keep up with the hyperinflation, the state drops all pretenses of legality. They stop asking for taxes and start taking assets. This is the phase of direct confiscation. It is the moment when the government declares that private property is a privilege, not a right. A privilege that can be revoked at any moment for the salvation of the state. The mask falls off completely. History provides terrifying precedents for this overt theft. In 1933, under Executive Order 6102, the United States government criminalized the possession of monetary gold by any individual. Citizens were forced to turn in their savings to the government in exchange for paper currency that was immediately devalued shortly after the confiscation. This was not a tax, it was a seizure. It was a declaration that the wealth of the citizen actually belongs to the state, and the citizen is merely holding it until the state needs it. This effectively destroyed the ability of the population to protect themselves from the government's own mismanagement. Often, this confiscation targets specific, vulnerable groups first to test the waters. In medieval France, King Philip IV, deeply in debt, arrested all the Knights Templar. his bankers, and seized their immense wealth to balance his books. He burned them at the stake not for heresy, but for solvency. In the Soviet Union, the kulaks, successful farmers, were liquidated as a class, their land stolen by the state. The pattern is always the same. Demonize a group that has wealth, blame them for the nation's struggles, and then loot them to feed the Leviathan. It is looting masquerading as justice. The seizure eventually extends to the land itself. In the late Roman Empire, the tax burden on land became so high that farmers simply abandoned their fields. The state then confiscated these deserted lands. But without farmers, the land produced no food. The state became the largest landowner in the world, yet its people were starving. This is the paradox of total control. By trying to own everything, the state ensures that nothing is worth owning. The motivation to improve, build, or plant is annihilated when the harvest can be seized at a whim. This phase marks the psychological death of the economy. When property rights are abolished, trust evaporates. No one invests in the future because there is no guarantee they will be the ones to benefit from it. The time horizon of the society shrinks from decades to days. People stop building stone houses and start building temporary shacks. They stop planting oak trees and start planting quick crops. The civilization literally becomes less permanent. The grand architecture of the past is replaced by the decay of the present, as the capital stock of the nation is consumed to keep the dying system alive for just one more day. When the money dies and the property is taken, the only thing left to destroy is the people themselves. The economic pressure becomes so intense that it shatters the social cohesion of the nation. The empire tax pattern enters its ugliest phase, the social fracture. The state, desperate to deflect blame from its own incompetence, turns the citizens against one another. It is the divide and conquer strategy applied to one's own population. This fracture begins with the rise of the informant culture. In imperial Rome, they were called the delators, professional accusers who made a living by reporting their neighbors for tax evasion or treason in exchange for a cut of the confiscated property. This destroyed the concept of community. You could not trust your business partner, your neighbor, or even your family. Every dinner party conversation was a potential death sentence. The social capital, the trust that greases the gears of a functioning society, was ground to dust. A society without trust cannot trade, cannot build, and cannot survive. As resources become scarce, tribalism explodes. The state encourages this by blaming specific groups for the economic collapse. The hoarders, the speculators, the foreigners, the unpatriotic. In the dying days of the Weimar Republic, political factions fought openly in the streets. It wasn't a war against the government. It was a war of all against all. The citizens, blinded by the narrative of the state, fight over the scraps of the dying empire rather than uniting to fix the root cause. The anger that should be directed at the palace is directed at the shopkeeper next door. The crime rate skyrockets, not just from desperation, but from a breakdown of moral order. When the government is the biggest thief in the land, theft becomes normalized. If the emperor steals my gold, the peasant thinks, why shouldn't I steal my neighbor's chicken? The rule of law, which is based on the idea that the law applies equally to everyone, evaporates. It is replaced by the rule of force. The strong take what they want, and the weak suffer. The police, underfunded and corrupt, become just another gang demanding protection money. Ultimately, the population physically disperses. This is the phenomenon of deurbanization. Cities are machines of commerce, but when commerce is punished, cities become death traps. In the 5th century, the population of Rome fell from 1 million to under 50,000. People fled the city to return to subsistence farming in the countryside. They chose the hard labor of the soil over the parasitic taxation of the city. The great metropolises, once the jewels of the empire, become ghost towns haunted by the memories of a glory they can no longer afford to maintain. Eventually, the math wins. The debt cannot be serviced, the army cannot be paid, and the currency goes to zero. The complex systems that keep a civilization running, the supply chains, the aqueducts, the trade routes, snap. This is the collapse of order. It is not a slow fade. It is often a sudden, terrifying plunge into darkness. The lights go out, and they do not come back on. The collapse usually begins with a failure of the supply chain. In a hyper-specialized economy, no city feeds itself. Rome relied on grain from Egypt. London relies on global shipping. When the currency is rejected by foreign merchants, the ships stop coming. During the fall of the Bronze Age, the intricate trade networks that connected Mycenae, Egypt, and the Hittites suddenly disintegrated. Without tin and copper, they couldn't make bronze. Without grain, they couldn't feed the workers. Famine is the first horseman of the collapse. The grocery store shelves go empty, and the veneer of civilization is stripped away within 3 meals. As the central authority dissolves, power devolves to the local level. This is the birth of feudalism. When the emperor can no longer protect you from the bandits, you turn to the local warlord who can. You trade your freedom for safety. The citizen becomes the serf. This happened across Europe after the fall of Rome. The grand, unified empire shattered into thousands of tiny, warring fiefdoms. The world became smaller, darker, and more dangerous. The universal laws of the empire were replaced by the whim of the local strongman in the castle on the hill. Knowledge itself is lost during this phase. As survival becomes the only priority, education, art, and science are viewed as luxuries. The Dark Ages were not dark because the sun stopped shining, but because the light of literacy dimmed. The great libraries are burned or abandoned. The engineering secrets of how to build a dome or mix concrete are forgotten for 1,000 years. Humanity effectively moves backward. We see the terrifying fragility of progress. It is not a straight line up, but a constant struggle against gravity. The final stage of the collapse is the silence. The noise of the bustling empire, the markets, the debates, the parades, is gone. The population has crashed. Nature begins to reclaim the monuments of human hubris. Vines grow over the triumphal arches. Trees sprout in the forum. It is a time of reset. The parasites have killed the host, and in doing so, they have killed themselves. The bureaucracy stars without a productive class to feed on. The slate is wiped clean, usually at a horrific cost in human life. But history is a wheel, not a line. After the fire, the green shoots eventually return. The collapse of the parasitic state creates the conditions for a new beginning. The crushing taxes are gone. The stifling regulations are forgotten. The debts are wiped clean by default. In the ashes of the empire, the survivors, the strong, the resilient, the prudent, begin to rebuild. The cycle resets. This rebuilding always starts with sound money. The survivors have learned the hard lesson of inflation. They reject the worthless paper and the clipped coins of the fallen regime. They return to gold, silver, or commodity money. Money that cannot be printed or debased by a bureaucrat. Trust is slowly reestablished. Trade begins again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The merchant and the producer are once again the heroes of the story, for they are the ones who can feed and clothe the shattered world. Liberty finds a brief window to flourish. Because the state is weak or non-existent, the individual is free. There are no permits required to build a barn. There are no taxes on the harvest. This period of salutary neglect often leads to an explosion of innovation and prosperity. The Magna Carta was born from the weakness of King John. The Renaissance emerged from the fractured city-states of Italy. Freedom is often the child of chaos. It is in this fertile soil that the next great civilization takes root. However, the warning must be sounded. As the new civilization grows wealthy, the parasites will eventually return. The memory of the collapse will fade. A new generation will be born that takes prosperity for granted. They will start to demand free things from the state. They will elect politicians who promise to rob Peter to pay Paul. The bureaucracy will begin to grow again. The currency will be debased again. The taxes will rise again. The empire tax pattern is not a one-time event. It is a recurring disease of the human condition. The question is not if the cycle will turn, but where we are in it right now. Look around you. Do you see the cannibalization? Do you feel the inflation? Do you see the social fracture? The Roman citizen in 400 AD thought his empire would last forever, even as it burned around him. We are not immune to the laws of economics. The ledger always balances in the end. The only variable is whether we balance it with wisdom and reform, or if we wait for history to balance it for us with collapse. The choice is ours, but the time is short. If you want to survive the cycle, you need to understand the history of money itself. We've produced a deep dive documentary on the only asset that has survived every empire collapse in history. Click here to watch The History of Gold, and secure your future.